Okay, I'm going to welcome all of you to the second part of my presentation. What we will do, we'll start with Gutenberg at this point and go forward with the history of the book, especially as it involves the classical text. So we'll go from the mid-15th century up through about 1810, 1820 as a stopping point. And so we will work with the 15th century book. We'll work on this point with, to begin with, of course, 15th century book that switched from a manuscript to a print culture, early printing, and we'll see how the book has evolved over the time to 1820 or so. And so, as you may recall, we left with Gutenberg, and we'll pick up with Gutenberg. Johann Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany, produced the first book, a substantial book in Europe. As I mentioned before, the Chinese had developed movable type, actually wood movable type. The Koreans had used metal movable type decades before Gutenberg. But because of complexity and the number of characters, it was not economically feasible for them to continue. And so they went back to a manuscript culture with printing from woodcuts, as we talked about the early first session. And so there's no correlation between what happened in China and the rest of Asia with Europe. And as far as we know, we understand Gutenberg was the first. And so the understanding that we have now is that Gutenberg was probably, he might have been Jewish, but he was probably a gold worker or a silversmith. And his claim to fame is in adapting two things, adapting technology and the creation of new technology. Adapting of existing technology, he had ink, which was oil-based ink, and pigments were available. Paper was available. The press that he used was probably an adaptation of a wine or olive press. These are things that he adapted for his press. What he invented, and actually it's still unsure whether or not this is true or not, was how he created the individual pieces of type. The standard story has been that he used a mold, it's called a matrix, a metal mold, in order to create pieces of type. Hot metal was poured into these matrices, and over again, they were, the letters will come out. There's some controversy that perhaps he used a lost wax and sand-based system, but at this point, I think he probably used the matrices. That's my own personal opinion. And so the problem was the metal of the type. He had to develop a metal alloy that was hard enough to withstand the pressure of the press, but still soft enough with a low enough melting point to be able to produce in large quantities. And so putting these together, the new technology of creating individual letters, with existing technology, he came up with this press, a printing press. The first book was not, the Bible was not printed, was not dated. There's a French binding that's dated 1455, so we know roughly 1454, 1455 is when he finished this book. The questions arise why he would choose a large Bible. We have a facsimile of the Gutenberg Bible, and it's about this thick, and this, of course, just one page of it. I think he was looking at the market and realizing that a pulpit Bible might be something that he could make money on. He was looking not for religious purposes, but he was looking as an entrepreneur now, looking to make money. And so what he understood was that if you could take manuscript, which this is the manuscript that we looked at before, and make it several 125 copies, pages at a time, and create something over and over again. Each page, of course, was the same. He could make money. And so, and the Bible is actually one of the most beautiful objects, world objects. It is absolutely fabulous. He made very few mistakes. He did make some mistakes, but you can imagine what it looked like back in the day when this paper was pure white, and the large type, and actually the decoration as well. What occurred after Gutenberg created his Bible was that what he needed during his time in finding this new invention was capital, was money. He had borrowed heavily from what would be modern terms, capital individuals who lended money. Just like if you've got a new idea, a new invention, a new website, you need money, you need backers. He had backers. Unfortunately, he went bankrupt after his Bible came out. His creditors took over his press, and Gutenberg basically vanished from the scene. But his legacy lives on. It's been estimated that there are upwards of 1 million items that were printed between 1455 and 1501, which is called the incunable period, which means in Latin, out of the cradle. And so you can imagine going from a manuscript culture where if you had 10, 15 books, that was a large private library, to seeing all sorts of books, pamphlets, indulgences, playing cards, all sorts of things being printed right and left throughout Europe, and also books as well. Case in point is this is our earliest, almost extant book. This is printed by a man named Nicholas Jensen, who was French, who went to Germany to learn the art of and practice of printing, and then went to Venice, which was the place to be in late 15th century Europe. This is a copy of his Suetonius on the lives of the 12 Caesars. As I mentioned before, this is actually on paper. The Gutenberg Bible leaf is on paper. But look how much a waste of paper. This was a beautiful book. This was an expensive book to produce. But if you look at it close up, you can see some interesting aspects of this book. You can see that the initials are A, C, S, D, P. These are all written in. So these are all done by hand. But if you look carefully, you'll see the initials have been carefully written out in manuscript. This is because the person doing the rubrication, doing the decoration, probably or more than likely couldn't read. But they could look at the individual letters and say, well, that's a C, that's a D. And so when you bought a book at this point, what you bought was a pile of printed paper, the first person who bought that book. And you negotiated with the bookseller as far as how you want it decorated, how you want it bound, actually if you want it large size, small size, depending on your individual taste and pocketbook. And so this was a very expensive book to produce, and most of the books of the 15th century were expensive. They were larger formatted books like this. No title page. Gutenberg Bible doesn't have a title page. Manuscripts, for the most part, didn't have much of a title page. And so there was something called a colophon, which this book lacks, and we'll talk more about that later, about this particular book and its relationship to later printing. The colophon was at the end of the book, and we'll see examples of colophons which gave the name, the title, who published it, when it was published, and where it was published. This is a later edition of Suetonius. This is 1488. This is published in Bologna in Italy. You can see it's been decorated by hand. But if you look closely, the letters are no longer in manuscript. The little catch letters are now are printed. And so this could have been decorated, but for some reason, or whatever reason, this was not decorated, which has commonly occurred. This is not unusual. It was cheaper. This book, unfortunately, has lost its original binding. And it actually was out of order as far as the pages. There was no pagination. And so it was a chore to catalog to make sure all the pages were there. So once again, this is 1488. You can see how much larger how much smaller the margins are. This was probably a less expensive book than the Gensis Antonius. This is what they refer to as a Sammelband. What it is 4 separate works that were separately published, separately printed, that were bound together. Still has original boards, original binding. You can see there's a vellum. Remember we talked about vellum in the first presentation. Spine for extra protection, and then wooden boards. And that's where we get the boards of a book, because a lot of early books were made out of wooden boards. This is actually quite charming. If you open it up, you see somebody's drawn a picture of an elephant. This is Ovid, the Metamorphosis. This is actually all the title page consists of, is this part right here. This is Ovid, this is 1505, so this is not really what they call incunable, this is just post-incunable period. But you see already at this point the letters woodcut initials rather than something decorated, and see how the text goes all the way to the margins. And actually what this is, and this, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we'll talk about this book. The Ovid Metamorphosis is the central part and commentary flanking. This was quite commonly done. And so what took place, and actually some marginal notes throughout in a manuscript hand. What took place was, first of all, the standard texts were published, were printed, including, as I showed you, this Antonius by Jensen. This saturated the market, and then finally at that point, then books with commentary were printed, such as this Ovid. The next book is an earlier book. This is Suetonius. You see the same type of title page feature. Look at the difference in paper. This is actually, this is the same age. Yeah, we just go back. Colophon. Here's your colophon, which tells you who published it, where it was printed, and when it was printed, rather than the title page. This is from the same period. This is actually a little bit earlier. I think it's 1481, so 20 years old. But look how the paper has not held up as well. It's not as bright. And look how the text is crammed together as closely as possible, because they try to get as much text on this page as possible. And once again, the commentary is huge in this page, and the Cicero text is relatively small. And I think this also has, yes, some marginal notes throughout, a typical 15th century book. But you see the spaces here for the decoration, which this book was never decorated, which is sometimes the case, or often the case, especially for scholarly works, because scholars tend to be cheap and not have as much money. And so this is the end, and actually has a colophon right there. This is the third work, and I can't remember whose work this is. I'll apologize for that. This is, anyway, we'll just look at the text. This is Ursissius, the Orations. I don't know who that person is, but look at the initials. This is a little bit later. The initials are woodcut initials. We talked about woodcut, how to create woodcuts earlier on in conjunction with the Asian book. But the wonderful woodcut, which could have been colored, hand-colored, but in this case not, annotations once again. And then the final book, Justinius, the Histories, with woodcut initials once again, marginal notes, fairly substantial in some pages, original notes, but just the text and not commentary. And as is often the case, the last pages are broken, are missing and damaged, which is often the case. I would have to make a plug for the Remnant Trust, which is part of our group. Remnant Trust has fabulous early printed and manuscript resources, and they generously allowed me to use this book. And they're very generous as far as offering their resources widely to anyone who is interested. This is another Remnant Trust book. This is a little book of Cicero. I think this is 1481. Let's take a look. 1481. This is a beautiful book. We look at the illuminations here, decoration. That spot there originally is actually made out of silver and it's tarnished, and so you can imagine when the book was new how this shone. And this is a relatively small book for the incunable period. Most of them were larger, but you see it's been decorated, and it's got the little the letters, the capital letters have been printed, and it's been decorated. And a couple of things I wanted to point out in this book, besides the beautiful hand-done initials, Greek. This is Greek type, but look how the space is here. And I'm thinking that Greek type had probably been done at a separate time. So this page had to be printed twice. First with the Roman type, and then it was reset up with the Greek type. For some reason, maybe they didn't have the Greek type when they printed the book. They had it a little bit later. And this has some, if I can find the page, in the back of the book, some annotations. This part of the Cicero has annotations. And then at the very end, a wonderful, I think it has coat of arms, a coat of arms. Somebody's drawn a coat of arms. And that actually could be researched to find out who owned the book at an early period. Nobody's done that. I don't think anybody really knows the coat of arms are there, but now you do. And if you want to come in and work with this and find out who owned this book, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. This is what is commonly called the Nuremberg Chronicle, and this is a heavy bruiser. This is 1493. This was published in Nuremberg. This is actually a facsimile. This was an incredible, this is the most highly illustrated 15th century book ever created. This was extremely expensive to create. Starts out with an index. This is a history of the world. This is a 1933 facsimile. We actually have the real thing in German. The second edition is German. The first edition is the Latin. You can see a coat of arms could easily have been placed here. This whole page could have been decorated. And so with the biblical creation of the world from Genesis, the heavenly spheres, of course, at this point, the earth is the center of the world, of the universe. And there is the earth, upside down for some reason. The fixed planets, the moon, the sun circling the earth, and then the fixed stars and the hand of God creating everything. And so it does the biblical creation. This is expulsion from Eden. Once again, we talked about that. This is actually a quite complex illustration where you see the serpent and Adam and Eve and the temptation, and then the expulsion all in one illustration. This is quite interesting. This is one of the last, if not the last, map of the world that doesn't show the New World. Columbus had done 1492. There was maps by 1493 of his voyage, from his voyage. The problem was this book was several years in the making. This woodcut was already created. by 1493. Been probably created a number of years before, and so they didn't want to change it. And so, like I said, this map is probably one of the last, if not the last map of the world without referencing the New World. Page after page of illustrations. These illustrations actually were reused, like kings and queens and rulers were reused, but what definitely was not reused was conveniently on leaf number 100, which is the largest woodcut in the book. The city of Nuremberg, where the book was made and where the money came to create this book. The city looks remarkably similar to this, even to this day. Actually, this is a paper mill with the fortress on the hill and the wall and the moat around the old part of the city. You can see all sorts of things that are depicted: hailstorms. There is there's Jesus and crucifixion. And so at the end, actually, of course, the end of the world, you get some very wonderful, large, if I can find them. Oh, there's burning individuals. You get these illustrations where you've got skeletons playing music and dancing and coming out of the grave. There's Jesus ruling the world with Mary and Joseph, and you can see individuals going up to heaven, and some of them are going down to hell. So a remarkable book for its period. You can see it's a huge size. I mean, this was a very expensive book to produce. We're going to return to our copy of Suetonius, the 1471 printed by Jensen, because it's actually a quite fascinating book and reveals a lot about why we collect, what we collect, and about the history of the book. 1471 Venice. And I purchased for this book knowing that it had faults. It had some things that were missing, and we'll talk about those right now. And so right here is this initial P has been removed. And so what would have been removed would have been initial similar to this. And so the question is, the proposition I paid, I usually don't talk about how much I paid, but I think it's, in this case, is relevant. I paid less than $10,000. I paid about $8,000 for this, which is a chunk of change. There's no question that one book for $8,000. However, if the book had been complete with all the initials, it would have been a $30,000 proposition. And so the question is, why would you take a book that was $30,000 potentially and make it worth a third of what it was of its value? And the answer is you wouldn't. And so, because what happened here? Why were these initials removed? These beautiful initials that were removed from this book, and the reason was that this was not always a $30,000 book at the end of the 19th century. Up to early 20th century, these books were a dime a dozen, and people would buy them for their children, parents for their children. They would cut up the initials, make initial books, and then either toss the book or put it on the used book market again and as a damaged book. And so this is what happened to this book, I conjecture. That these initials were removed for another purpose. And fortunately, this book was not thrown out. And so one thing, and so that's why this is teaching. This tells you something about this life of this particular volume, what it's gone through over his life. It doesn't have his original binding that's been rebound. And so when I purchased this book, one thing I want to know is it complete? And so I looked in the back of it This is kind of difficult with just myself, but I will carry on. The L and the O, and I read the text, and then we actually had, and I'll put this down, a copy printed in 1515, the same text, the Suetonius and the Life of the 12 Caesars. Remember the L and the O, here's the L, here's the O, and so I figured there was another page. But if you will focus on this page, I don't know how close you can get. One thing that you see is there's Greek type. And so I said, well, okay, there's Greek type, that's interesting. There's Greek, it needs to be Greek. That Greek type should have been right here. There's no Greek types, and so two things was going on. First of all, Jensen had not developed his Greek type yet, had not cut and not designed and cut or created his Greek type. And so this book, in order to be read, needed to have the Greek and should have been put in a manuscript. And so somebody went through all the expense and trouble of decorating the book with the initials and the rubrication, which is the blue and the red, but they didn't pay for someone to finish the book out in manuscript in the Greek, so it can't be read completely. And so it's a corundum. Why would you want to do that? What possible use would this book have in the 15th century, 1471? And my best guess is that it was probably a coffee table book, very expensive book, a book not really to be read, but to be admired. I've got a Jensen, look how the beautiful type. This is Roman type has never been equaled, but I'm never going to read it. And so this took place where the market was saturated with text like this. A lot of printers and publishers and booksellers went out of business because the business model of producing beautiful, expensive books no longer worked. And so what took place was a man named Aldus Manutius. And Aldus Manutius decided, this is from 1500, this is Aldine, they call it Aldines. This is Lucanus, to produce these small pocket books, as it were. He came up with the italic type, italic meaning from Italy. Italic type at that point was used in order to put as many letters together, as scrunch as many letters together. You can see how small this book is. These were an incredible hit. And he basically conquered the market. And so what Aldine did, he wanted to produce the best text possible. And so remember, I'm dropping a book here, the manuscript of Horace from the first session, and so he found manuscripts like this throughout Europe, edited them, found the best text, and produced the best text in the least amount of time. He wasn't a careful editor. He was out to make money, and so some of his editing was suspect, but he produced printed text. And unfortunately, he destroyed the manuscripts. He destroyed throughout the manuscript. He thought there's no longer necessary. I have the printed text. And so this is a Lucanus of 1502. This is another Aldine for 1524. You can see the remnants of the beginnings of a title page. This is Homer Iliad, and so this is in Greek. But once again, he's got a title page, but he actually looks like this should be, it could have been decorated, but none of these books we have, these small books, these Aldines, have been decorated. And so he probably, looking back from our point of view, should have had a woodcut initial rather than this small initial, thinking that these would be decorated. The audience for these, what was he looking for? He was looking for people that could afford these books, so not only scholars, but individuals who were wanting to learn the Roman and Greek classics. in the upcoming and the beginnings of the middle class. This is a 1507 Aldine. It lacks that his printer's mark, but once again, the italic text and the initials here, and the book has never been decorated, but it has been annotated in manuscript throughout. And it has a colophon, and actually an index as well. 1521, another a fairly full title page. But once again, it doesn't have the initials, the woodcut initials. We can go through here, 1517. I'm sure it's going to be the same way. Well, maybe I shouldn't be sure. Aldine's printer's mark. And yes. And so this is this is actually a different book. This is actually Aldine, but later in the century. Look how more elaborate this title page is. I mean, this is for the buyer to become an attractive book, but once again, the initials rather than a woodcut initial. It was supposed to be in manuscript. Here's another Aldine. You can see this is 1546, so a title page. Once again, I hate to pick on Aldine, but the letter here should have had a woodcut initial, or could have had a woodcut initial, italic text type as we come to we know. And I'll show you a colophon on the back, and then his stamp. I will go through a number of these Aldines, and then we're going to go look at other publishers. Here's an Aldine. Once again, a title page is the Catullus. But look, this is actually a little bit later. This is 1562. Woodcut initials. They finally figured out the people are not decorating the books, and they're going to sell better if we use woodcut initials. So that's what we're referring to, a woodcut initial. But still italic type and very small, still a pocket book without a colophon, interesting enough. 1588, probably the same thing. Actually, that's a different publisher that goes over here. Here is actually a quite fascinating book. This is Aldus and his sons and his heirs published not only small books but large books. So you can see Venice, 1557. This is Aldine with its. You recognize probably by now that this is Aldine, Aldus, but you see these white places here, and so you turn the page, and the white pages are repairs, and what's been repaired is actually quite interesting. A man named Philip Melanchthon, who is a colleague of Luther. Evidently, this is probably book is on the list of the prohibited books by the Catholic Church. And so this is a level of censorship, early censorship, and we see two other books later on that shows evidence of censorship. And so his name was removed using what they call an iron gall ink, a very iron-rich ink, and that has actually over the years eaten into the page. And so his text wasn't, if you go to 81, which is right, 79, 81, is that right? 77. His name has been removed here, is censored. But the text itself is still complete. So just his name, for whatever reason, there's different levels of the prohibited books, and his name could not appear on the book. So this is probably done by the publisher after the book was printed. The censor came in and said, you've got to remove that author's name throughout the book. He was very much a Protestant, and his writings were obviously in part seen by the Catholic Church as something suspect. And so a large Aldine, and then once again the Aldine here. As I said before, there were other publishers. This is from 1521. This is a book with a large title page from a different publisher. And so when was this published? Let's look at the 1521, as I said before. And so the text itself, of course, in Latin is the center, and the commentary is on the outside. This book is actually from 1588 with a full-blown title page, a beautiful title page with a wonderful, this is the printer's mark, and woodcut initials throughout. So more of a modern book, a modern look. This is another book of Cicero from 1557, a large formatted book with an index to begin with, woodcut initials. We see how, like the Suetonius, remember how the wasted space, they're not wasting any space with this book at all. And this book has actually been annotated in manuscript as well, so double columns. And see if it has a colophon. Well, somebody's done some ciphering, some numbers in the back, and with a colophon in the back. But look how some of this paper is quite nice and others is not. And it's had some evidence of beetle. Beetles have been coming, and not bookworms, but beetles, and eating some of the paper. So, an original binding. We've looked beginning with Gutenberg. We've gone through the books of the 16th century, the 1500s, and now we're going to start in the 17th century book and take a look at a few examples of those. This is Petronius. The paper you can see is very browned. The books are becoming cheaper and cheaper as the centuries go along. But very much, this is an engraved title page. Engraving means that they were incised in metal, probably steel or copper, and then printed on the page. So it looks like it's text here. It's actually there's individual pieces of type. This is all done on a copper, probably a copper plate. Large portrait of not the author, but the patron of the book, the patron who the author or the editor wanted to impress. But look how the pages of the book, this is very cheap paper, but it looks like a fairly modern book, except of course the paper's pretty bad. Index on the back. This is a book from 1677, and I can't remember who the author is. This is our friend Sallust again. And so a title page, the publisher's going to have, yes, an engraved. They spent a lot of time and effort and money on this wonderful, called frontispiece, in order to attract a buyer to the page. And then actually this paper is quite nice still. That was cheap paper. This is actually quite nice paper. It looks like the Sallust text is here. and it has commentary on, so it's a scholarly work. I talked a little bit earlier about prohibited books. This is actually a book that shows some censorship. This is an Italian book from 1581. And what's taken place, this is Jerusalem Liberated by Tasso. And if I can find the page. Evidently, some of the text was prohibited. And so somebody's gone back and written in manuscript the prohibited text. So going around, this was censored at the publisher, at the printing office, where this text was not to be printed. But somebody had another copy or knew of how to complete the text. And so this is how this text was, how they circumvented, the owner circumvented the censors. This was actually as well, this is the rhymes of the Sir Marino. And so what's taking place here is that this was censored after the book was printed. This whole, what they call gathering, was everything had the censored part. And so it was removed from the book and was bound. And then somebody found the same text from a different book and located it and glued it into the text into the book in two different places. And have a little note in Italian saying, "I finally have completed my dear little book." This is a beautiful book. This is French. We're now in the 18th century. Ovid Metamorphoses. Remember in the first lecture about the books that had text, the text-driven or image-driven. This is very much image-driven. This is like the greatest hits of Metamorphoses. And so large, beautiful engravings with small engraved text. The French are renowned for making beautiful books, and this is no exception. Unfortunately, it is also falling apart. And this is, once again, Cicero. This is not Cicero. This is Ovid, published in London by Jacob Tonnes. If you see this wonderful illustration here, once again, they spent a lot of time and effort and money on making these illustrations as elaborate as possible. And if you see red and black, you know that went through the printing press twice, once for red, one for black. All this to attract a buyer to this text. And the text is pretty small. They spent a lot of time jazzing up the beginning of it to attract a buyer, and the rest is pretty, in my mind, pedestrian. A lot of 17th century books were that way. And here's another early 18th century book. I think this is our Cicero. Yes, Cicero. Once again, the standard issue, wonderful illustration, one frontispiece, red and black, and then bad paper. The paper has brown, and a pretty boring text. So a scholarly edition has been annotated or actually aligned by someone throughout the life with the index in the back. Two books remain, and both of those are early 19th century. This is actually the newer of the two, but since it's a classical text. This is Catullus, published in London by a man named Pickering in 1824. This is what they call the Diamond Classics. You can see how small it is. What this actually is a very important book, this series, this Diamond Classics. These were the first books ever commercially printed, bound in cloth. Everything else beforehand, cloth that was used, but not publisher's cloth. So each of the books had the same cloth, draper's cloth that was used. Pickering was inventive. He figured out if he could make these books cheaper, and by binding them himself in cloth, they could make them cheaper. And of course, the small text, the paper, of course, is the most expensive part of the book still at this point. And so these little Diamond Classics are gem. They're hard to read because the text is so small. They're kind of reminiscent of that small leaf of the book of Job. But they're just very dainty and I say historically important. The last book is one of my favorite books. This is written by a man named Comenius, who's actually a 17th century educator. This is a book on teaching children how to read Latin. Published the one and only edition, the first edition in the United States, published in 1810. The original was from Latin to German, but this is Latin to English. What's quite interesting about this book, in the preface, is that it starts out with the illustration showing the professor or the teacher and a prospective student, showing the age of the students. And it starts out with the various animals and what they sound like. Non-heliocentric world. The world revolves around the earth. These woodcuts, and actually it's interesting, this is the world, and it starts with, of course, Adam and Eve. It's ironic that a book right now couldn't be used in a setting for students because there's nudity in the book. It says the outward parts of a man, showing a half-naked woman, both in Latin and in English. And there's dragons, there's basilisks in this book. And so there's various occupations. Stove with the bedroom, the horseman, philosophy, and ends up with a list of other books that the publisher would like to sell you at the time. So if you like this book, maybe you like something else that he has to offer. This concludes my talk. I hope you have enjoyed and learned something. And I want to invite each and every one of you to come and visit us in person. If something you saw interests you or you have any questions, just email me directly and I'll be glad to work with you. Thank you.